Hey everybody, I'm Candace Shibley with Utah State University Extension and the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, and you are watching our Water Well with CWEL webinar series.
I'm Stephanie Dewar. I'm the Water Conservation Manager for Salt Lake City Department of Public Utilities, a position I've been in for coming up on 20 years now, which seems sort of odd and surreal. And I am a department or a division of one. When I jokingly refer to the conservation team, it means me, with the exception of USU, who's been a great partner literally the entire time I've been in this position, and they've done so much to help inform and improve conservation programming in Salt Lake City. And it's exciting to be here today to talk about WaterMaps and how we'll be utilizing WaterMaps for conservation programming for not just now, but into the future. So
I'm Joanna Enterwada, and I'm a professor in the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State University. And I'm very, very happy to be affiliated with the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping that sponsors this seminar, seminar, and also to lead the WaterMaps team, a group of professionals that have done some really amazing things in helping with the analysis of urban landscape water use. And so this is a WaterMaps presentation, but the application to Salt Lake City is really the very important part of the presentation and how it will inform conservation programming. And so we're going to start with Stephanie leading off and talking about the conservation planning that they've been doing and the goals they've set and how WaterMaps then is going to help meet those goals.
Okay. Thanks, Joanna. So we're going to do a very quick overview of our conservation plan, which we just completed. As a matter of fact, it goes to City Council tonight for final approval, hopefully. And the reason we're starting with the plan is really what drove me to wanting to be engaged with USU and the WaterMaps project, was seeing the opportunity of how it could inform not only our, basic understanding of how water is used within our service area, but more critically, what our capacity to conserve could be. So sharing with you some components of our conservation plan will help sort of set the stage of how WaterMaps will help inform programming now and into the future. Next slide. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with our service area, Salt Lake City Department of Public Utilities, by the way, is one of the oldest retail water providers in the West, having been in existence since the mid-late 1800s. We service 360,000 people through 90,000 connections, both residential and a complex and varied commercial, industrial, institutional base. We provide water to Salt Lake City proper, but also to the communities of Mill Creek, Holiday, Cottonwood Heights, and portions of Mill Creek, Midvale, and South Salt Lake, which can make programming and planning a bit complex. But we have wonderful partners in with our partner cities. The lavender area is shows you the area of our service, with the red and blue areas being small pockets within our service area, representing University of Utah, and then portions of Holiday that have separate supplies or suppliers, though we do provide some water to both of those entities. Next slide. So we recently completed our Water Conservation Master Plan update, which is a state-mandated plan to be updated every 5 years. And it was heavily influenced by a recently completed supply and demand study and a conveyance and storage study. And so the bulk of chapters 1 and 2, which are about supply, demand, and historical use, are very engineered and science-driven. So what we determined based on the supply and demand study and the major conveyance study was that our current demand is around 95,000 acre feet. Our projected future demand is around 127,200 acre feet. Our future, our current supply or current demand levels would be 97,620 acre feet, with a future demand estimated at 126,120 acre feet. Now, the thing about this future demand, too, is that we did take into account projected growth and climate change, though we can only we have to make assumptions about what those impacts will be. The other part of our future demand is within that we have a redundancy plan so that we don't plan to spend every drop of our water in a sense. And we do plan to have water held in storage or redundancy, if you will, so that we can helps us mitigate drought impacts or if we have interruptions in supply. We also base our future supply and current supplies on dry years, not wet years, which is the safest planning scenario. Based on these calculations, we estimate that we'll actually have a shortfall of around 16,080 acre feet of water annually. And so the conservation plan's goal is to help capture that water because we have no new supplies other than potentially reuse water and aquifer storage and recovery. Next slide. So Salt Lake City has had a robust conservation program since about 2001. Since that time, we've reduced our use by about, a little bit too far.
Got it.
By about 27%. And we've reduced our peak day demand by 31%. This is significant for outdoor use as we assume peak day demand is driven by our seasonal outdoor use predominantly for landscapes and such. That's okay. Anyway, so we've done a good job, but one of the things we recognize is that we have more to do. We've actually coincidentally saved about 16,000 acre feet a year, averaged over the last 19 years. So 16,000 acre feet a year over 19 years. So a lot of water. What we need to do, though, is address the next level of conservation. You can see there on the statistics what our current per capita is. Keep in mind, per capita consumption is not per person consumption. And if we also look at indoor versus outdoor, we have a lot of variety there in terms of whether our demand is very seasonally based, in other words. And we also have strong commercial and institutional uses, which affect base level water uses. Next slide. When we consider both historical demand as well as projected future demand and conservation goals, we consider a lot of categories. A lot of discussion and dialogue in Utah when we talk about conservation sometimes focuses just on outdoor water use. But I wanted to share this with you, even though WaterMaps is focused on outdoor water use. As an overall strategy for conservation, we have to consider both indoor and outdoor use and a variety of subcategories. So we look at hospital use, hotels, restaurants, churches, schools, triplexes, apartments, businesses, industry, manufacturing. All these different components are part of our analysis of how we use water and how much we have to save, which helps us understand how to get to our goal. Because without knowing exactly how people use water, it's hard to help them identify strategies that are effective and that are sustainable. And so knowing water use under these subcategories can be very important. Next slide. So moving into our goals, in summary, I already mentioned we need to save about 16,000 acre feet of water a year. What this represents is in the next actually 4 years, we need to reduce nearly 7%. And this is total consumption across our entire service area through all of our classifications, so all our different kinds of customers. And we have to reduce 11.3% by 2030. And the long-term planning goal is 22.3%. Now, mind you, these goals aren't fixed. They may be altered as we deepen our understanding of the impacts on both our supply and demand from climate change. As growth changes in our service area, if we have faster growth or more growth than we anticipate or more industrial growth, that might affect how we have to structure our conservation goals. But the other important part about this is as we understand where we have the capacity to conserve water, we may also reevaluate the goals because we may learn that there are areas we could save more than we thought. And this is where WaterMaps comes into play because it helped us understand on a deeper level, literally on a parcel by parcel level, how we use water. Next slide. So our conservation goals, and again, this is just sort of to give you the overall picture. We need to save water both indoors and out, and that's actually, we need to save water both indoors and out. And I'm hesitating because I realize that's not quite the slide I wanted to show, but that's okay. So yes, and it's actually 16,000 acre feet of water that we need to save. But we know we can do this. We've already had a very good response to conservation programming up to now, and we now have better tools that will help us more directly address specific water use practices, especially out of doors. Next slide. And this is just a summary of it's a closer view of the table of what we need to do in terms of reduction over the next 5, 10, and 40 years. And the reason we do this is we want to be able to track where we're going and make sure that we stay we stay on track to achieve our conservation goals. We don't have any future water supplies. We have no other water to develop. So what we can achieve through conservation is going to be critical to sustaining our community, supporting our local environment, as well as supporting our economic base and our standard of living. And you can see here the percentage of outdoor reduction, and this is across all categories of water users, is roughly just under 15%. And that's additional to what we've already conserved. Next slide. The other component of our conservation plan is what our program measures and practices are, and they're divided into a number of categories. The one most relevant for today is both outreach and our research and metrics programs. And the criteria for selecting all of our programs is that they actually have to help us reduce water use, eliminate water waste, or educate and inform our community, or enhance our stewardship ethic. They also have to be fair and equitable. Programming needs to address all our user types and not put burdens on one set of users over another. Financial and social equity are incredibly important issues within our service area and to our utility as a whole. They also have to provide a cost benefit to the city and to our customers and the utility as well. Next slide. So when we did our conservation programming, one of the things we looked at in setting our goals for reduction is every single subclassification, how much water they used as an average rough calculation, how much water we needed each group to reduce, and then we actually took that to a per connection level. This information is a bit rough. We meter every single property, so all water connections, all water users are metered. They're read. The meters are read monthly. Some meters are actually read daily because they're automated. They're advanced metering infrastructure systems. So we have a lot of information. What we don't necessarily have is always the best classification on our billing system, which was actually computerized in the 1980s. So it's a bit archaic and a little fragile. So we estimate indoor versus outdoor water use based on seasonal patterns of use, but we don't actually know how much water someone is using. The other thing is we don't know if someone is using too much water. We just know the volume of water they're using. So we don't have a way to know whether their use is reasonable or not. And again, that's where a program like WaterMaps will really help inform how we do future planning. The rough estimate of water savings is currently we're using about 22,300 acre feet of water out of doors at a single family residence in terms of that classification. So all single family residences. Our goal for the future is to reduce that to 19,039 acre feet, which is a savings of over 3,000 acre feet and 14%, nearly 15% of our total water use. Next slide. So as we think about how we use water maps in this analysis in terms of our program implementation, a program like WaterMaps, which you'll hear more about in a moment, it helps us both with, and we can talk about this. This may make more sense talking about it after we talk about WaterMaps, but we'll be using it to help pre-qualify and post-verify involvement in a number of conservation programming measures, interventions. It'll also help us measure program effectiveness. More broadly, WaterMaps will identify the actual capacity to conserve out of doors, which will help us make adjustments in those projected goals and use reduction levels. It will help us with target marketing, and you'll learn how we'll do that soon in terms of directing programs at specific types of customers, because we'll they'll be the most effective for those customers, and because we'll have the most return on that investment with them. It'll also help us address sort of a neighborhood approach to conservation programming and identifying areas or groups of customers who can help, that we can intervene with so that we maximize the use of our resources. And the last thing it will do is help us with benchmarking and identify where we are now in terms of our outdoor use, and help us track future changes to our outdoor water use patterns in a way that is literally on a parcel by parcel level, so we know how well we're doing on our conservation programming. All of this is really important, and it's important. One is because we have to be successful in our conservation efforts. It's also important because, as I mentioned sort of in the beginning at the introduction, I am an office of one. I serve an area that's over 123 square miles. I have 90,000 connections, 360,000 customers, and I do my work on my own, except for with my partnership with USU and the great citizens that I serve in Salt Lake City service area. So our resources for programming are limited in terms of time and financial investment into programs. So having WaterMaps will help us target conservation programming to where it will have the biggest impact, so that we can make that investment go farther, have a better rate of return, and be able to achieve and sustain conservation reduction or conservation savings for the long haul, so we can meet our future goals and keep our community safe. Next slide. I think you're on now.
Okay. Thanks, Stephanie. So we're going to just focus on some of the WaterMaps analysis that we've done in phase one of a project. So we have finished up and have just delivered a report, a phase one report to Salt Lake City Department of Public Utilities. And in that phase one, we've done a baseline WaterMaps analysis for single family residential sector for the years 2014 to 2018. And this was proof of concept of it, worked out some things doing a historical analysis. But one of the things I wanted to note is that the WaterMaps is used for diagnostic purposes to go find where capacity to conserve exists. There are things that happen on the ground that may explain some of the patterns. And so the follow-up and delivery of conservation programs to those locations is an important part and follow-up to refine the ability to predict. But the bottom line of what I'm going to present of the outcome of phase one is that it provides evidence that capacity to conserve does exist to meet the conservation goals that Salt Lake City Department of Public Utilities has outlined, but it helps to go find it. Salt Lake City's been a real leader, and due to Stephanie's efforts in water conservation in the state. So they have made great strides within the city already in water conservation. In the future, the water conservation that they're looking for is a little bit harder to obtain. And so that's why the more detailed analysis of where you go to find it and then the programming that goes with that is really important. In phase two, we're going to be continuing the analysis. And one of the important things, and you'll see weather comes into the analysis in terms of trying to determine plant water need and landscape water need. So in evaluating a lot of different weather products for ET, which is a main factor that we need, we realized that because of its mountainous terrain and the variability within the Salt Lake City surface area, we wanted to get as exact as we could. So I'm really happy to report that the very first thing that we've already done this fall in phase two is to actually install and or upgrade 6 Utah Climate Center weather stations. They currently have one in Murray. We've worked with some golf courses and we've installed some completely new, and we have made all 6 consistent with each other. They will be calibrated and maintained by the Utah Climate Center. And this is going to be really critical for the future analysis. We were very happy to secure the funding to create that network of weather stations. It's kind of unparalleled for an urban area because they tend to be more located in agricultural areas. We're going to...
Joanna, do you mind if I add one thing there about the weather stations? Sure. One of the other exciting things about it is because the data is will be carried through the Climate Center website, any water user can access that data. So if you're a homeowner and you have an irrigation control device and you want to improve your programming, you can actually tap into the data available through the and find the station that's nearest you. Commercial companies that have irrigation control devices where they send out signals, they can utilize this data as well. So it will help inform our program and improve the data set within WaterMaps and a number of other functions within the utility service area, including helping us with stormwater issues. But it will also help a lot of other customers potentially because of their access to improved data. So it was a great partnership with USU and partly funded through a grant through EWIG.
Yeah. The Extension Water Initiative is what she was referring to, the EWIG grants, and that's been very helpful. So it's a really critical piece of instrumented infrastructure that allows this kind of analysis to occur. And the other thing is that we've worked with the golf courses in Salt Lake City, and Stephanie has a whole nother program that's working with public parks and golf courses to improve water conservation there. So they were very happy to have those, and it's going to help with that project too. We're developing, and you saw a beta test of it in a previous slide, a Conservation Manager Viewer application where for very specific properties, you can drill down and see historical use information. You can see the range. You can see if a resident has changed, and that's a different account, so you know whose behavior you are looking at, so that as they go to deliver programs, they can first go in and do a little bit more detailed analysis of a particular property to see what may have been occurring in the past. We're going to expand the WaterMaps analysis to include institutional and commercial properties, do some focus groups and surveys, and some more customized and more dynamic WaterMap software applications for their use in program delivery and customer portal for people to look at. So let me just go through a little bit. Here are the cities within Salt Lake City Department of Water Utilities in their service area, and the green area on this map are the residential parcels that they service, and these are the ones that we analyze for those 5 years in our phase one report. This is a simple graphic with a whole lot of data and analytics behind it. But basically, what WaterMaps does is it calculates landscape irrigation ratios for each parcel. And to do that, it needs parcel data and land cover data and water meter data and weather data. But you can see from this simple schematic that it helps you to determine the variability in the reasonableness of water use or the overuse in some locations, and helps you identify the places with capacity to conserve. So the landscape irrigation ratio is a landscape water use estimate divided by a landscape water need estimate. Getting to those two fairly simple numbers is quite complicated, and our team does a tremendous amount of work to be able to get to these landscape irrigation ratios and have confidence that they are a reliable indicator of what is occurring on the ground. It helps us to categorize different groups, color code it, and try to pull out the ones where delivery water conservation programs could yield the greatest benefit. So the real big heavy lift in a lot of this is the manual editing that's needed to improve multispectral imagery so that the characteristics of the landscape can be properly conveyed and utilized in WaterMaps. So there's a very intricate land cover classification scheme, and there is going to be a follow-up presentation on this in February at the same series of how this is developed by other members of our team. And so with this land cover classification, we're able to assign the correct factors to the different types of landscape material to adjust DT to estimate their need. So this particular graph shows you a couple of important bars. The blue bars that you see are showing total ETO, or reference evapotranspiration. But for different types of land cover, that ET is adjusted to meet their need. And so the dark green bars would represent what grass needs and what shrubs needs or what sparse vegetation will need. The thatched bars are giving a complete representation of, given that land cover for the service area as a whole, for these different years. The orange bars are showing you the average use on a property for given average landscape cover, the average use of water, and the blue bars are the blue thatch bars are the average need. What you will see in all of these years is the use exceeds the need, and that is the overall capacity to conserve. But where does that exist? So one of the other things I want to show you is that we can calculate this, and the billing data is generally monthly. And so we can look at the patterns over the course of an irrigation season. This is something that analytically we're very focused on, because we know that at a seasonal level you can characterize the use, but when does it occur, in addition to where it occurs, which I'll talk about a little bit more, is important. We used to think that a lot of the overuse was at the tails of the season, and clearly there is a lot of overuse in October still. But early in the season, and the season is technically classified from April till October for this service area, there isn't a lot of overuse, but the overshoot, the overuse, the applying more than people need, is really in the height of the summer, when people are, what we think, playing off of the indicators of heat, but not clearly clued into the soil moisture, retention of the soil, and some other factors. And the compelling information from this can help assure water customers that they could reduce use in the height of the summer, potentially without sacrificing the amenity and the values and the health of their landscape, which is certainly what we want to be able to maintain. So one of the things that we did in running this calculation is, or this analysis, is that we sort of did a cross classification of both these landscape irrigation ratios, which is a metric of efficiency, with the volume of water that people use. And that volume was characterized by the pricing tiers of metered water. And in running this cross classification, what you find out is you at least have some different conservation priority boxes here. You have high conservation priority in this first category, where they're using both high volumes and they have high LIRs, meaning they're terribly inefficient. This is a very simple cut at a landscape irrigation ratio of 2. You saw on the previous slide that we call 1 or less efficient and 1 to 2 acceptable, and over 2 are categories where we really want to direct some conservation efforts. These next 2 boxes, category 2A and 2B, which are yellow, would be the next, but for different reasons. This category 2A is a medium conservation priority, and it's characterized by high volume, but low LIR. They're fairly efficient, but they're using high volumes of water. And correspondingly, this category 2B has low volumes of water, but high landscape irrigation ratios. So on small properties, they're inefficient. This category 3 really is a low conservation priority, and in some of our previous research, we have realized that these tend to be a lot of the people that volunteer for conservation programs because it's on their mind and they're trying to conserve, but a lot of these people would and sometimes do fit in this category: low volume and low landscape irrigation ratio. So let me show you what we do with this information and how it's helped. But this is the categorization we're going to work with in the next several slides, so I wanted you to see that. Well, first of all, this graphic shows the percentages of residential parcels that are in each category. And the colors are the different years. And you can see that it's a fairly consistent pattern over this 5-year period. The bulk, or over 50% in the 60s, of properties are really in this low conservation priority category. And then you have more in these upper 2 categories, which clearly have higher volumes of water use, percentages of the parcels. And then this low volume but high LIR is a smaller percentage of parcels. Now let's look at the water, though, that these different categories could potentially yield. So when we look at the total conservation capacity, which in this case we defined as, let's say they reduced any of the use over a landscape irrigation ratio where they're watering to meet plant water need. Let's call that the water conservation capacity. In each of these years, how does that conservation capacity align with these different parcels in these different categories? And here you see that clearly the high volume, high LIR category has the biggest bulk of the water that can be obtained. This is the annual conservation capacity, just the percentages. And then again, this high use 2A category, but there's still conservation capacity in all of the categories. Everyone has a part to play. And in this low volume, low LIR category, category 3, the reason you find some conservation capacity is because we are, at least in this simple cut, defining that as a landscape irrigation ratio of less than 2. So anything between 1 and 2, there's some capacity here, and that can be secured through certain types of programming. Here now are some numbers on the actual gallons that we could anticipate, just, in this diagnostic analysis of the average annual gallons per household saved on average in each of these categories, given the number of households that were there and the capacity and volumes that we estimated could be obtained. What you see here is clearly, again, how much difference you could obtain in terms of volume saved in this high capacity compared to ones that are already efficient. But here's where another this 2B, medium conservation conservation priority category, comes up as being able to yield a fair amount of water. It's low volume, but high in efficiency, and for that, they can obtain more. Now, I should note that the LIRs in this analysis range up to 10. For ones that were over 10, we actually eliminated them from this particular analysis so that we could look at them a little bit more closely, because that is a fairly unreasonable range. But so this category has ones over 2, but it can go up to 10, representing potentially 10 times the amount of water that the landscape actually needs. So now I'm going to have Stephanie come back in to the conversation, because that type of analysis can show what you might want to think about in terms of delivering different conservation programs to these different categories, or to households that fall in these different categories.
Yeah. So, for instance, early on when we were looking at these this diagnostic outcomes, one of the things we noticed was, there's this assumption if someone is using a lot of water that they're being wasteful, or if someone's using a little water that they're being efficient. But what we were finding were some properties that were very small footprint, and we were also assuming our lowest water users and most efficient users would be on smaller properties. What we actually found was an interesting number of properties that had a very small footprint and low volume of water use, but really high consumption compared to what they actually needed. So we did a lot of discussion and sort of research and some ground truthing, which is where we actually went out and physically looked at landscapes to discuss what could account for how properties fell out into different categories. And this is important to us because not every water user with an outdoor landscape needs the same intervention or same action to help them reduce water savings. And we don't have enough resources so that everybody can have every program available. So how would we direct programming at specific water users? So it seemed sort of intuitive that obviously if someone has a high LIR, so they're in category 1, so they have a high volume of use and a high LIR, they're a target, or not a target, that sounds horrible. They're a priority property in terms of directing programming to them, whether it's the water check. We have a water check and app alerts. We want to make sure they get advanced metering infrastructures, which are water meters that would send signal. They actually are meters that send a signal every 15 minutes to a tower. And this would help us think with things like leak alerts, or to know how frequently they're actually watering in live time, so that we could message them through the water check app and say, hey, we noticed that you've watered 3 times this week already. You don't need to water a 4th time. They might be great properties for landscape alteration assistance, or for irrigation system rebates. Right now, for instance, if you look at this chart, it talks about tier 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those tiers reflect our billing structure, and those tiers are based on analysis of where customers fall out in terms of water use. So originally, tier 1 was a slightly elevated volume of water over what the typical indoor consumption is for that basic indoor water use need. Tier 2 was set at, it's now set at 30 CCFs, which is 100 cubic feet. And the reason it was set there was our average customer in Salt Lake City was actually using about 32 CCFs, 32 to 35. We built in a 10% reduction in that. So the goal is that that's reasonable outdoor use. And then 3 and 4 are, as Joanna said earlier, overwatering and excessive watering. So they're not based on any type of budget. And if you exceed a tier, you just go into higher pricing. But maybe through the WaterMaps technology, we can find a way to provide watering budgets or more directed watering schedules to some of these properties that have this great capacity to conserve. And as you look at the next few slides, you'll see that what we've done here is by looking at each of these categories and then making some educated and calculated assumptions about behavior or property characteristics, we can then deliver targeted interventions to maximize the outcome of those interventions. So for instance, category 2B properties, which are properties that have a low volume of use and high LIR. A lot of those properties are a bit smaller, or they've begun to change their landscape, but they haven't changed their watering regimen. So if it's a smaller property, but they're overwatering, providing say a landscape intervention isn't necessary potentially because they have such a small footprint. But really, this might be more of a behavioral issue. They don't know how to control their controller. Maybe their irrigation system is inefficient or they're watering too much. So making sure they get a water check, doing a ground truth survey to determine what their landscape actually looks like so that we can verify that it's a low water landscape or a small footprint landscape with a high use. We also might reach out to them to say, hey, we noticed that you have a higher water use than we would expect for your property size. What can we do to help you? So those could be some of the strategies we might approach with this category of water user. And then in category 2A, which is our high volume of use but low LIR, we assume those might be larger properties or just any property where a person is watering efficiently, but they just have enough landscape that their water use is in tier 3 or 4. So they may not need the same level of intervention because they're being efficient, but they may need help either with system efficiency. So a water check is always a helpful thing. Landscape alterations. These may be properties we would direct something at to help them reduce their lawn size or help them with hydrozoning or other interventions. We might help them with irrigation system rebates. And we also, again, might help with directed survey by asking them questions like, hey, you're very efficient, but you use a lot of water. What would help you reduce your water usage on your property? And the next slide, the last category 3, we don't want to ignore these customers. As the diagnostics outcomes from WaterMap shows, there was a fair amount of 12% potential capacity to serve on these properties, but the volume of water is large because the number of properties that fall within this category is very, very large. In fact, it's the largest category, which is something that I'm pleased to see. It shows the work that our community has done in terms of becoming efficient. But most every property has the ability to improve its efficiency. So one thing we want to do with these properties, though, is recognize them and reward them for a job well done. And so we might create programs around recognition and reward. But we also want to talk with them and study to identify their keys to success, to see if there's something we can learn about what they do, or maybe they can even become community leaders or block leaders to help their neighbors improve their system efficiency or their landscapes.
And one of the things I just wanted to add there is this is sort of a simple, on an annual basis, They might fall into one of these categories. We've also developed the conceptual framework for tracking LIRs as they move around in this space and change over time. And those are very interesting. We suspect that sometimes we have seen, sometimes you'll see change in what category they would fall into with a change of resident at a time a house turns over, or in rental properties, or different kinds of things. So there's a tremendous amount of additional analysis that we have to do, and in tracking them over time. So so what we're excited about is it has both the spatial and temporal components to really drill down and help understand this landscape water use behavior to design even future programming that will help people to continue to be successful when they are, and to conserve when they aren't doing that already.
Yeah, it's like one thing we learned in this analysis here and in grouping properties by classification over a number of years is that the number of properties in category 3 has reduced. And so the question is why is that? Do we have new owners in those properties? Has the impact of climate change affected their watering patterns? Are they watering more because of that? So, to Joanna's point, there is more study and research to be done. But in the meantime, we have solid information to begin acting on. And as a matter of fact, because of the outcomes from WaterMaps, we're actually launching some rebate programs this spring. And we're using WaterMaps and the Water Check to do that pre-qualification and post-verification of program participation so that we can maximize the resources available for those rebates and make sure they go to the homes that can have the biggest impact on helping us save water.